Tonight, let me whisper you the history of ancient civilizations. Welcome back, dear listener. Before we drift into the past together, tell me from which corner of the world you are listening. Are you in a quiet city, a distant village, or somewhere in between? Wherever you are, let's slow our breathing and step softly into the fading world of the Late Bronze Age. Picture a time more than 3,000 years ago. Across the eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms and empires flourished. Palaces gleamed with treasures, ships carried goods across the sea, and scribes recorded the affairs of kings on tablets of clay. This was an age of confidence. Rulers believed their reigns were secure, their walls strong, and their gods protective. The air was filled with trade, diplomacy, and the hum of daily life, much like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Yet history often teaches us that what feels permanent may be fragile. Beneath the calm surface of this thriving world, small cracks were beginning to appear, cracks that would widen into a collapse that few could have imagined. Let us linger for a moment in this world at its height. The Nile carried life into Egypt's fields, feeding a civilization that had endured for centuries. The Hittite kings ruled from their capital at Hattusa, proud of their armies and alliances. To the west, the Mycenaean palaces of Greece rose above the landscape, their storerooms filled with oil, wine, and grain. And in the Levant, small but vibrant cities connected the greater powers through trade and tribute. Imagine the sea at this time, dotted with merchant ships, sails full of wind, their hulls heavy with copper, tin, ivory, and glass. The waters themselves were the lifeblood of this interconnected world, carrying not only goods, but ideas and stories. This interconnectedness was both the strength and weakness of the age. When one kingdom struggled, others felt the tremor. Like dominoes, their fates were quietly tied together, balanced on the edge of unseen change. From our perspective today, it is easy to think of these kingdoms as distant and separate. Yet in truth, they formed a delicate network, a web of exchanges and dependencies as intricate as the threads of a woven cloth. A cloth, however, can fray, and when even one thread is pulled too tightly, the entire pattern begins to loosen. This was the fate awaiting the Late Bronze Age world, though its people could not yet see it. For now they celebrated festivals, honoured their gods, and conducted their business. Their letters spoke of marriages between royal houses, of trade agreements, and of gifts exchanged between distant rulers. The great powers even relied on one another during times of scarcity. Grain shipments crossed the sea from Egypt to feed the Hittites, while copper from Cyprus travelled to fuel the weapons of kings. In moments of peace, the sea was a bridge, but in moments of strain it could also become a highway for raiders, for refugees, and for forces that would not always bring prosperity. Archaeology allows us to glimpse these moments. Tablets and inscriptions reveal a world where kings addressed one another as brothers, using careful words to balance power and pride. Yet even within these exchanges, hints of strain appear, pleas for aid, warnings of unrest, and acknowledgements that supplies were not always enough. The calm veneer of stability masked a fragile reality. Still, daily life continued for most people. Farmers tilled the soil, fishermen cast their nets, and artisans shaped tools and ornaments. For them, the rise and fall of kingdoms was often distant thunder. Children played in courtyards, songs were sung in markets, and fires warmed family gatherings. These simple moments remind us that history is not only the story of rulers, but of countless unnamed lives. And it was these lives that gave the Late Bronze Age its richness. Every pot, every tablet, every tool unearthed today speaks to a world once full of voices, now quieted by time. Standing in the ruins of these places, we can almost hear the echoes. The laughter of merchants, the sound of chariots, the rustle of parchment, all now hushed beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence. It is in this silence that we begin to sense the fragility of what once seemed eternal. Power and wealth gave an illusion of permanence, yet history whispers that nothing remains unchanged forever. This was a world poised between greatness and decline. Though no one living then could have known it, they stood on the edge of an age about to vanish into memory. The signs would not come all at once. They would emerge slowly, like distant storm clouds gathering beyond the horizon, unnoticed by those who continued their daily routines. And as the storm drew closer, the network of kingdoms would prove more vulnerable than strong, more delicate than enduring. Interconnection, once their greatest advantage, would become their undoing. Tonight, we begin our journey into this story, a tale not of sudden destruction, but of quiet unravelling, where civilizations faded and the memory of the sea peoples rose in their place. So settle into stillness and let the hum of history guide you. For the world of the Late Bronze Age is waiting, balanced on the edge of change, its whispers ready to accompany your rest. To understand the Late Bronze Age, we must first meet its great powers, kingdoms that shone brightly across the eastern Mediterranean, each with its own strength, yet bound together by shared dependence. Egypt stood as the most enduring. The Nile's annual floods nourished its fields, providing harvests that sustained cities, temples, and armies. It was a land of continuity, its culture already ancient. Pharaohs ruled with divine authority. They were not only kings, but also intermediaries between gods and people. Their temples rose like stone prayers, carved with hymns that echoed through centuries. Beyond Egypt lay the Hittite Empire. From their capital at Hattusa, the Hittite kings commanded vast armies and controlled vital trade routes across Anatolia. Their diplomacy was sharp, their ambitions vast. The Hittites were masters of iron and chariots. Their warriors thundered across battlefields. Their scribes filled archives with treaties, letters, and royal decrees. Their presence anchored the northern world. To the west, the Mycenaeans of Greece rose in palatial centres, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns. These citadels crowned their hills with walls of massive stones, so large later Greeks believed giants had built them. Inside, storerooms brimmed with oil, wine, and grain. Artisans crafted gold masks, frescoes, and fine pottery. Linear B tablets recorded lists of goods, revealing an organized society humming with activity. Mycenaean kings, or Wenaks, commanded warriors who sailed the seas. Their ships reached distant shores, trading and raiding, leaving traces of their presence from Cyprus to Anatolia. Farther east, the Levant offered a patchwork of small but vital city-states: Ugarit, Byblos, Tyre. These ports connected empires through trade, serving as gateways for wood, metals, and luxury goods. Though modest compared to great empires, these cities thrived as middlemen. Their merchants spoke many tongues, their harbours filled with ships from distant lands, their markets bustling with exchange. In Mesopotamia, Assyria and Babylon watched closely. Though not yet dominant, they remained powerful players, shaping diplomacy with their wealth of grain, horses, and crafted goods. Each of these powers relied on the others. A shipment of grain from Egypt could ease famine in Anatolia. Copper from Cyprus fueled weapons and tools across kingdoms. Balance held them together. Treaties formalized these ties. Rulers addressed each other as brother kings, exchanging gifts of ivory, gold, and lapis lazuli. Diplomacy travelled along the same sea lanes as trade, yet alliances were fragile. Behind words of kinship lay rivalries, suspicions, and shifting loyalties. Even in peace, these empires watched one another with cautious eyes. The might of these kingdoms was displayed not only in battles, but in monumental architecture. Temples, palaces, and fortresses rose as symbols of order, wealth, and stability. Egyptian temples glittered with painted reliefs, while Hittite fortifications loomed with carved lions. Mycenaean citadels stood on rocky heights, their walls echoing the power of their rulers. Yet beyond walls and monuments, the human lives within made these powers real. Farmers, artisans, soldiers, and scribes gave shape to the daily rhythm of empires. In palaces, scribes recorded shipments of grain. In villages, potters turned clay on wheels. In fields, labourers harvested barley. Each act, however small, sustained the great powers. Religion bound these societies. Egyptians honoured Ra and Osiris. The Hittites worshipped storm gods. Mycenaeans prayed to deities later known in Greek myth. Temples linked earth to heaven. Festivals and rituals reinforced identity. Priests led processions, incense burned, hymns rose. These sacred rhythms offered comfort and continuity to people living under powerful but unpredictable rulers. At sea, ships carried not only goods, but ideas. Writing systems, myths, and artistic motifs travelled across the waves, weaving cultures together in ways both subtle and profound. The Late Bronze Age was, in many ways, the world's first international age. Powers communicated, exchanged, and sometimes fought, but always remained aware of one another's presence. The strength of each kingdom rested not only on armies, but on the delicate web of trade and alliances. When the web thrived, so did the powers. When it weakened, all felt the strain. For now, these kingdoms appeared strong, their monuments impressive, their records abundant. But history shows us that strength can be deceptive, and permanence often illusory. The great powers of the Bronze Age stood tall, yet unknowingly they shared the same fragile foundation. Their brilliance set the stage for a collapse that would come quietly, reshaping the world forever. To truly see the Late Bronze Age, we must look at its web of trade, a network so vast that it tied distant kingdoms together like threads in a single tapestry. The heart of this network was the Mediterranean Sea. Its waters carried ships laden with grain, copper, tin, and countless goods that linked empires to villages across its shores. Copper from Cyprus travelled in heavy ingots, shaped like ox hides. Tin came from faraway lands, rare and precious, joining copper to make the bronze that gave the age its name. Without this flow of metals, chariots could not be armed, tools could not be forged, and the power of kings would quickly dim. Bronze was more than metal, it was survival. Grain, too, crossed the sea. Egypt's fertile Nile Valley often supplied others, sending shipments north to ease famine in Anatolia or to feed garrisons along distant coasts. Timber from the Levant, especially cedar, was prized by Egypt and Mesopotamia. Straight, strong beams built ships, temples, and palaces, carrying the scent of faraway forests. Alongside necessities came luxuries, ivory carvings, glass beads, gold jewellery, and exotic animals moved along these same routes, delighting the wealthy and impressing foreign courts. Merchants were the quiet heroes of this system. They sailed stormy seas, navigated coasts, and built trust among strangers through contracts, gifts, and reputation. Letters found in archives reveal requests for shipments of oil, for payments in silver, and for delivery of precious horses. These records show how carefully balanced trade truly was. Palaces served as central hubs, storing goods in vast magazines, their storerooms filled with amphorae of oil, jars of wine, and piles of textiles, treasures of both necessity and wealth. Caravans also played a part. On land, donkeys and oxen carried loads of grain, wool, and metals across dusty roads, connecting inland kingdoms to coastal ports. The Levantine cities thrived as middle points. Ugarit, with its bustling harbour, became a vital link where ships from Egypt, Anatolia, and Cyprus exchanged their cargoes. In these ports, cultures mingled. A single market might hear Egyptian, Hittite, and Mycenaean voices bargaining side by side, trading not only goods, but stories and customs. Trade was more than economy, it was diplomacy. A shipment of grain could seal an alliance, a gift of ivory could mend a quarrel. Commerce softened rivalries, at least for a time. Yet this strength hid fragility. The web was so tightly woven that if one thread snapped, if one harbour failed, if one route was blocked, the entire system trembled. Famine in Anatolia meant more demands on Egypt. A rebellion in Canaan could interrupt shipments to Hittite armies. A single storm could sink a ship carrying vital tin. Dependency created vulnerability. Kings who once boasted of their wealth sometimes begged their neighbours for aid, their survival tied to the reliability of distant trade. The Amarna letters, clay tablets from Egypt, reveal these exchanges. They contain both warmth and desperation. Requests for gold, pleas for grain, reminders of obligations unmet. Beneath the formal words, we sense unease. Trade created unity, but it also created tension. What if a neighbour refused? What if goods never arrived? What if ships stopped sailing? In this way, the prosperity of the late Bronze Age rested on balance, an invisible balance that few noticed until it began to slip. For common people, trade meant availability of goods they might never produce locally: tools, oil, fine textiles. When networks faltered, scarcity rippled quickly into daily life. Markets fell quieter, storerooms grew emptier, and the comfort of abundance slowly faded. To those living then, the change may have seemed small at first, almost unremarkable. But each small disruption built upon the last. Over time, the great web strained under pressures it could not endure: climate, unrest, and the arrival of strangers by sea. The very system that once made the late Bronze Age thrive would become the channel through which crisis spread. The cloth that bound kingdoms together began to fray, and as the threads loosened, silence crept in. The fragile web of trade, once the heartbeat of the Bronze Age, was about to unravel, carrying empires with it into history's quiet shadows. The great kingdoms of the late Bronze Age did not fall overnight. Their unravelling began with quiet signs, almost invisible at first, like faint ripples on a calm sea. One of the earliest troubles came from nature itself. Periods of drought spread across the eastern Mediterranean, reducing harvests and straining supplies. Farmers who once trusted the rhythm of rains faced uncertainty. Fields yielded less grain, and famine pressed on communities that had once thrived. With shortages came unrest. Hungry people grew restless, villages strained, and rulers who had promised abundance found their authority tested. Earthquakes shook cities as well. Archaeology shows collapsed walls and toppled palaces, reminders that the land itself could turn against human ambition. Some regions rebuilt after quakes, while others abandoned their ruins. Slowly, entire landscapes bore scars of instability. Alongside natural pressures came human ones. Banditry increased along trade routes, disrupting the flow of goods and creating fear among merchants. Ships that once carried copper and grain now sailed under threat. Pirates and raiders prowled coasts, turning lifelines of trade into dangerous paths. Letters from kings reveal growing anxiety. Requests for food became urgent, and complaints of disloyal vassals filled diplomatic correspondence. Alliances, once steady, began to fracture. The trust that bound kingdoms together weakened as rulers struggled to provide for their own people. The Hittite Empire, dependent on grain imports, felt particular strain. Their pleas to Egypt for supplies reflected desperation, not strength. Egypt itself was not immune. Border tensions and internal unrest challenged the stability of the Nile Kingdom, even as it still seemed strong to outsiders. In Greece, Mycenaean palaces faced raids and fires. Their fortresses remained impressive, but beneath the stone, cracks of vulnerability spread. Smaller city-states in the Levant bore the heaviest weight. Caught between larger powers, they struggled to maintain independence and safety. Ugarit, once a thriving hub of trade, recorded letters of panic. Messages begged for help as threats closed in from sea and land alike. Each local crisis fed into the next. Drought led to famine. Famine bred unrest. Unrest weakened defences, and weakened defences invited attack. These were not sudden disasters, but slow accumulations of strain. A world once balanced began to tip toward disorder. To ordinary people, life grew harsher. Scarcity forced harder choices, travel became dangerous, and trust in leaders began to fade. Communities that once celebrated abundance turned inward, more cautious, less secure. The sense of shared prosperity diminished. Across the region, people must have felt an unease that was hard to name, a quiet awareness that their world was no longer steady. For rulers, the signs were clearer. Letters filled with urgent tones, armies stretched thin, resources diverted to secure fragile borders. Even victories in battle could not mask the growing fragility. Success on one front only exposed weakness on another. Slowly, the interconnected system that once held kingdoms together became a network of vulnerabilities, ready to unravel. These first signs were only the beginning. The storm's gathering would soon test every empire, every city, and every village across the Bronze Age world. And into this fragile landscape would come mysterious new forces from the sea. Peoples whose presence would change the course of history forever. As the late Bronze Age trembled under drought, unrest, and weakened trade, a new force began to appear along its shores. Ancient texts call them simply the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain a mystery. Some scholars suggest they came from the Aegean, others from Anatolia or beyond. What is certain is that they arrived suddenly, in waves. To those who lived then, the Sea Peoples were strangers. They appeared not as one people, but as many groups, travelling by ship and seeking new lands. Egyptian records describe them with foreign dress, feathered headdresses, and distinctive ships, unlike those of the kingdoms they threatened. Their movements may have begun as migrations, families displaced by famine or conflict, seeking refuge and opportunity across the sea. Yet migration and invasion often blurred together. When hungry people arrived in large numbers, tensions turned quickly into violence. Archaeological layers show cities burned and rebuilt, then burned again. The sea peoples were not always conquerors, but their presence often meant disruption. In some places, they may have settled peacefully, blending with locals. In others, they came as raiders, leaving ruins where palaces once stood. Egyptian inscriptions tell of great battles against these newcomers. Pharaohs cast them as enemies, but the records also reveal respect for their determination. Medine Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, depicts vivid scenes of the sea people's arrival, ships locked in combat, warriors clashing with Egyptians. The reliefs show families as well as fighters. Women and children travelled with them, suggesting entire communities on the move, not only armies. Their ships were large, with high prows and sterns, capable of carrying many passengers. They were built for endurance, not just speed. Such vessels hint at skilled seafaring knowledge, perhaps gained through generations of life on the water. These were not aimless wanderers. Among their names appear the Sheridan, the Peliset, the Checker, and others. Each a group with its own identity, yet together remembered as the Sea Peoples. For the kingdoms they encountered, distinctions mattered little. To them, the newcomers were a single, pressing threat. Cities along the Levant fell into turmoil. Letters from Ugarit speak of desperate appeals for aid as enemy ships closed in on their harbours. The suddenness of their arrival magnified the fear. Already weakened by famine and unrest, kingdoms found themselves unprepared for such relentless pressure. The Sea People's impact was not only destructive. In some places they reshaped cultures, introducing new tools, pottery styles, and ways of life. History often remembers them as destroyers, yet they may also have been survivors, carrying fragments of their old worlds into new lands. For Egypt, they became a defining challenge. Ramesses III claimed victory against them, preserving Egypt's independence when other powers crumbled. Yet even victory carried cost. Egypt endured, but its strength waned. Its resources were drained, and its future stability diminished. For the Hittites and Mycenaeans, the Sea People's arrival coincided with collapse. Capitals burned, palaces emptied, and records ceased. We cannot say the Sea Peoples caused the fall of empires, but their movements accelerated a decline already underway. In their wake, silence spread across once vibrant centres. Trade routes closed, scripts disappeared, and centuries of knowledge slipped into shadow. The Sea Peoples entered history as both mystery and symbol. Agents of change, remembered not only for what they destroyed, but for how their arrival marked the end of an age. Among all the kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, Egypt left the most vivid record of its struggles with the Sea Peoples. Its monuments still speak across millennia. Pharaoh Ramesses III, who ruled in the 12th century BCE, faced the Sea Peoples during the later years of his reign. His accounts remain our clearest window into those events. At Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple, vast reliefs cover the walls. They describe in words and images the battles fought against these newcomers. The inscriptions tell of invasions by land and by sea. The Sea Peoples moved with families, wagons, and warriors, pressing south toward the Nile Delta. Egypt had faced raids before, but this was different. The scale was larger, the threat more enduring, the determination of the newcomers more apparent. Rameses prepared carefully. He fortified river mouths, stationed archers, and deployed ships to meet the oncoming waves of invaders. The reliefs show dramatic naval combat. Egyptian ships intercept the foreign vessels, archers raining arrows while oarsmen keep the craft steady. We see distinctive details in these carvings: feathered headdresses, round shields, and ox-drawn wagons carrying families along the land routes. The sea peoples are shown as fierce and numerous, yet the Egyptians portrayed themselves as calm, ordered, and divinely supported. Rameses claimed victory, stating that he crushed the invaders and resettled survivors within Egypt's borders as captives and servants. His inscriptions declare, "Those who came upon the sea, their seed is not, their hearts and souls are finished forever." Yet we must read such words with care. Pharaohs often exaggerated triumphs, and records served as propaganda as much as history. Still, the scale of the depiction suggests real concern. Egypt rarely carved such detailed scenes unless the threat was grave. Archaeological evidence supports the turmoil. Sites along the Levant show destruction layers that align with the time of Ramesses' battles. The victory at the Nile did preserve Egypt when other kingdoms crumbled, but it came at a cost: resources drained, soldiers lost, and stability weakened. In the years after, Egypt maintained its culture, but its reach narrowed. It no longer projected power as widely as before. For the Sea Peoples, defeat did not end their journey. Some groups likely resettled along the Levantine coast, integrating into new societies. Others may have moved farther west, shaping cultures that would rise in later centuries. Their story did not stop with Ramesses' reliefs. To Egypt, though, these victories became defining moments. They reaffirmed divine order against chaos, a theme central to Egyptian belief. In temple art, the pharaoh is always larger than life, a figure of calm while enemies flail around him. Such imagery reassured Egyptians of their place in the cosmos. Yet beneath the carved stone lay a quieter truth. Egypt survived, but just barely. The battles marked not triumph alone, but survival amid decline. Unlike the Hittites or Mycenaeans, Egypt endured. But the Bronze Age system it had once thrived within was gone, replaced by fragments. The reliefs of Medinet Habu thus serve both as history and epitaph, reminders of resilience, but also of a world collapsing beyond Egypt's borders. In the silence that followed, the Sea Peoples lingered as memory. For Egyptians, they embodied both fear and the proof of Pharaoh's strength. These carvings still whisper across stone walls today, telling us of battles on the Nile, of victory claimed, and of an age slipping quietly into shadow. While Egypt managed to withstand the storm, other great powers of the Bronze Age were not so fortunate. The Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean kingdoms faded into silence. The Hittites ruled from Hattusa, a mighty capital in the highlands of Anatolia. For centuries they commanded armies, shaped diplomacy, and influenced vast territories. Yet by the early 12th century BCE, Hattusa was abandoned. Its palaces and temples fell into ruin, leaving only broken walls and scattered tablets. Archaeologists find signs of burning, but also signs of neglect. The city may have been struck by violence, but it was also slowly deserted by its people. Drought and famine had already weakened the Hittite lands. With grain imports cut off, survival became harder with each passing season. Internal unrest compounded the crisis. Local governors may have turned against the central authority, fracturing unity at the empire's heart. To the south, cities once loyal to the Hittites began to act independently, turning to Egypt or other powers for protection and trade. Without strong leadership, the empire unraveled. The royal archives ceased, treaties no longer renewed, and the proud Hittite kings vanished from record. In Greece, the story was equally dramatic. The palatial centres of Mycenae, Pylos and Tiryns had flourished for centuries, crowned by massive stone fortresses. Yet in the 12th century BCE, these palaces burned. Linear B tablets were baked into permanence by the flames, preserving the last records of Mycenaean administration. The causes remain debated. Some suggest invasions, others internal conflict, still others natural disaster. Perhaps it was all of these combined. What is clear is that the palatial system collapsed. The wannaks, the palace kings, lost power, and the networks of control dissolved. Without the palaces, the Mycenaean economy faltered. Farmers continued their work, but large-scale organisation disappeared. Craftsmen no longer produced fine luxury goods at the same scale. Long-distance trade dwindled, and writing itself faded from use. Communities retreated into smaller villages, self-sufficient but isolated. The world of grand citadels gave way to a simpler existence. To later Greeks, this became a shadowy time, remembered only in distant memory as the Age of Heroes. Legends of Agamemnon, Achilles and Odysseus may echo faintly from this era, but the historical Mycenaeans were gone. Across both Anatolia and Greece, the collapse brought silence where once there had been wealth and ambition. Roads that had carried caravans fell quiet. Harbours that welcomed traders now stood empty. The hum of administration ceased. For the people left behind, survival replaced ambition. The concerns of empire gave way to the concerns of village life. Yet even in decline, fragments endured. Pottery styles continued, oral traditions were passed on, and memories lingered in song and story. These fragments became seeds for future cultures. The Greeks of later centuries would look back on the ruins of Mycenae with awe and myth. The Hittite lands, too, were not entirely lost. Small Neo-Hittite states emerged, carrying on echoes of the old empire in new forms. But the great powers themselves were gone. The Hittites and Mycenaeans joined the list of civilizations whose brilliance could not prevent collapse. Their fall, alongside others, marked the true end of the Late Bronze Age, a silence spreading wider, making space for new peoples and new ways of life. When we look back on the Late Bronze Age collapse, it is tempting to search for one single cause. Yet history rarely bends to such simplicity. The truth lies in a tapestry of causes, threads woven together, each adding weight until the fabric could no longer hold. Climate played its part. Droughts across the eastern Mediterranean reduced harvests, straining both villages and palaces. Scarcity bred famine, and famine bred unrest. Hungry people demanded relief, and rulers struggled to provide. Natural disasters struck too. Earthquakes damaged cities, toppled palaces, and left vulnerable settlements open to attack. Archaeological layers show repeated destruction, suggesting that recovery became harder with each disaster. Internal conflict added further strain. Rivalries between local elites weakened unity, while rebellions rose against fragile kings. As authority faltered, people lost faith in palace systems. The very institutions designed to protect them became symbols of failure. External pressures amplified the crisis. The arrival of the Sea Peoples disrupted coastlines, threatened trade, and unsettled populations. Yet the Sea Peoples were not the sole cause. They were part of a wider movement of people, migration sparked by the same hardships that afflicted others. The interconnectedness of the Bronze Age magnified every shock. A shortage in one land spread across borders like ripples crossing water. Egypt felt Hittite hunger. Ugarit felt Mycenaean decline. No kingdom was untouched by the struggles of its neighbours. Trade, once the lifeline of prosperity, became a fragile thread. When it snapped, kingdoms accustomed to abundance faltered. Political systems, too, were brittle. Centralised palaces concentrated power, but they also concentrated risk. When a palace burned or a king fell, entire regions lost direction, administration, and security at once. The collapse was less a single blow and more a chain reaction, each failure feeding into the next, until the system unraveled. What makes this era remarkable is not only the scale of collapse, but the silence it left. Records stopped, letters ceased, archives were abandoned. The voices of kings and scribes, once so confident, fell quiet. What remains are fragments, hints of fear and desperation. Even victories, such as Egypt's battles, could not reverse the wider tide. Survival did not mean stability. The Tapestry of Causes reveals both fragility and resilience. Civilizations breaking apart, yet people enduring in simpler ways. Farmers still planted, families still gathered, life adjusted, even if empires could not. The late Bronze Age collapse was not only an ending, but also a transformation, a shift towards smaller, more localized worlds. The memory of grandeur lingered, but daily life turned practical, stripped of the splendor once promised by palaces. In this way, the collapse was many things at once: natural, human, internal, external. A slow storm that no one power could withstand. And as the storm faded, the great tapestry of the Bronze Age lay unraveled, its threads scattered, waiting for new hands to weave them into future histories. When the late Bronze Age collapsed, the noise of armies, merchants and kings gave way to something quieter, echoes left in the ruins. Cities once alive with trade fell silent, their markets emptied, their storerooms abandoned, their walls slowly crumbled beneath the weight of time. In Hattusa, once the proud capital of the Hittites, carved gates and fallen temples stood as lonely reminders of lost power. In Mycenae, the great citadel walls still towered, but inside, the palaces that once stored oil and wine were dark and deserted. Ugarit, with its vibrant harbour, lay destroyed. Its clay tablets, preserved by fire, remain buried until rediscovered thousands of years later. These ruins whispered of lives interrupted, of worlds shifted, of promises unfulfilled. Yet they also carried traces of resilience. People did not vanish. Villages persisted, fields were tilled, and families adapted to smaller, simpler rhythms of survival. The grandeur of palaces gave way to modest homes, where community mattered more than distant kings. Rite and systems faded. In Greece, Linear B disappeared, and centuries passed before literacy returned in new forms. The loss of writing silenced voices of administration, but oral tradition carried memory. Stories endured in songs and myths. Some myths may even preserve distant echoes of the collapse, tales of wandering peoples, of lost kingdoms, of wars fought over dwindling wealth. Pottery styles shifted, showing continuity but also change, as new techniques blended with old traditions. Across the Levant, new groups settled. Among them were the Philistines, perhaps descended from the Sea Peoples, leaving distinct marks in material culture. Egypt, though surviving, left fewer monuments of grandeur. The age of empire was over, replaced by narrower horizons. The echoes of collapse were uneven. Some regions shrank into hardship, while others slowly reshaped themselves into new communities. Trade routes quieted, but local exchange endured. Life adjusted to shorter distances and closer ties. Temples still rose, though on a smaller scale. People still prayed, offered sacrifices, and sought meaning in familiar gods. In ruins, we see not only destruction, but continuity. Amid collapse, daily life persisted in new, humbler ways. Archaeologists uncover both ashes and tools, both collapsed palaces and freshly dug hearths. One world ended, but another began. The echoes remind us that collapse is rarely total. Fragments carry forward, linking one age to the next. Children born in the aftermath did not know palatial grandeur. For them, simplicity was normal, and resilience became tradition. These generations shaped the seeds of later cultures, carrying lessons written not on tablets, but in lived experience. The ruins stood as silent teachers, their emptiness speaking of impermanence, their endurance reminded of survival. Even now, walking among the remains, one feels the weight of time, the echo of a world once mighty, now hushed. In those whispers, we glimpse both loss and continuity. The ruins speak quietly, inviting us to listen as history lingers in silence. As the Bronze Age faded, one name lingered in memory: the Sea Peoples. Their image became both mystery and symbol for generations that followed. Egyptian records kept their story alive. Reliefs and inscriptions cast them as enemies defeated, yet also as a force so great they nearly changed history. For Egypt, the Sea Peoples represented chaos resisted. Pharaohs celebrated victories as proof of divine order, restoring balance to the world. Yet beyond Egyptian stone, their memory blurred. No records from the Sea Peoples themselves survive. Their voices are lost to time. Instead, we see them through the eyes of those who feared them, enemies who carved them into history as both threat and curiosity. Archaeology fills some gaps. Pottery styles in the Levant suggest Sea Peoples settled there, blending their traditions with local cultures. The Philistines, remembered in later biblical texts, may trace their origins to these groups, carrying fragments of their identity into new ages. In this way, the Sea Peoples were not only destroyers, but also settlers, survivors seeking stability after long journeys. Their migrations remind us that collapse is rarely simple. Movements of people can break kingdoms, but also plant seeds of renewal. Memory often simplifies, casting them as villains who brought an age to its knees. But history whispers something more complex. They were families as much as fighters, men, women, and children travelling together, carrying what they could from lands left behind. Their ships, carved in Egyptian reliefs, tell of skill and determination, of journeys guided by hope as much as by force. In some stories they stand as shadows, outsiders forever threatening order. In others, they fade into the background, absorbed into new lands. What remains is ambiguity, a reminder that history rarely offers neat answers, only fragments shaped by perspective. To later generations, the Sea Peoples symbolize the turning point, the moment when the Bronze Age gave way to something quieter, smaller, and more uncertain. They embody both loss and transition, both the end of one world and the birth of another. The collapse they witnessed was not only of empires, but of memory itself. Writing systems fell silent, and centuries slipped into shadow. Yet even shadows carry meaning. The Sea Peoples remind us that survival takes many forms, even in the midst of upheaval. They were remembered because they were feared, but they endured because they adapted. In this, they mirror humanity itself. Across time, they remain enigmatic, never fully understood, never fully forgotten. Their story lingers in ruins, in reliefs, in shards of pottery, in whispered traditions that shaped later cultures. In quiet ways, their presence influenced the world that followed, long after their names vanished from official record. The Sea Peoples show us how history can echo without clarity, offering glimpses, but never a complete picture. Perhaps that is why they remain compelling. Their mystery invites reflection. Their silence encourages imagination. And so, as we leave the late Bronze Age behind, the Sea Peoples remain in memory, not just as raiders of an age, but as travellers across the currents of history. Along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean lay the Levant, a narrow strip of land where sea and desert met. Here, cities once thrived as bridges between empires. Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and Ugarit were among the most active. Their harbours welcomed ships from Egypt, Cyprus, and Anatolia, filled with cargo for trade. These cities were small compared to Egypt or the Hittite Empire, yet their influence was vast. They controlled timber, copper routes, and maritime exchange. The Levantine coast was a corridor of culture. Languages mingled in markets, and gods from one land found temples in another. For centuries, this coast pulsed with energy. Merchants filled ships with cedar wood, dyed textiles and glass, sending them westward. But when the late Bronze Age weakened, the Levant felt the tremors first. Its wealth made it attractive, and its openness made it vulnerable. Letters from Ugarit show the fear. Kings pleaded for aid, warning of enemies at sea and unrest inland. The tablets often end abruptly, as if the scribes were interrupted mid-sentence. Their silence speaks louder than words. Archaeology confirms destruction. Layers of ash mark where fire consumed palaces and warehouses. In Ugarit's ruins, charred remains of imported goods show how tightly this city was tied to distant lands. Coastal cities had relied on trade for survival. When trade faltered, so did their lifeblood. The Sea Peoples pressed hardest here. Their ships attacked harbours. Their families sought new homes along these shores. Some cities burned entirely. Others managed to survive, but never regained their former glory. Tyre and Sidon endured, but in diminished form. Their later greatness would rise only centuries after the collapse. For the Levant, collapse was uneven. One harbour might lie in ruins, while another carried on with limited exchange. Yet the pattern was clear. The great web of international trade had broken. The Levant's coast no longer thrummed with the same vitality. Families who once relied on imported goods returned to simpler practices: local farming, fishing, and craftwork. Palaces gave way to smaller houses, less adorned but functional. Luxury faded into practicality. The coastal shrines, however, often remained. People still prayed to their gods, even as the grandeur around them dissolved. Religious continuity offered comfort, linking survivors to a past that seemed slipping away. The Sea Peoples who settled here left traces: distinct pottery, new weapon styles, and foods that blended cultures. Over time, these newcomers became part of the Levant itself, woven into its fabric, like threads from distant looms. The shoreline that once echoed with foreign voices grew quieter, more localized, but it never felt completely silent. Instead, it became a place of transition, where collapse gave way to resilience and memory found new expression. The Levantine shorelines remind us that even in decline, life continues. adapting with quiet determination as history shifts its course. At the centre of the eastern Mediterranean lay Cyprus, a large island rich in copper. In the Bronze Age, its mines made it indispensable. Copper was half of the recipe for bronze. Without it, kingdoms could not forge tools, weapons, or ornaments that defined the age. From Cyprus, copper ingots shaped like ox hides travelled on ships to Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond. These shipments tied Cyprus to every major kingdom. Its harbours were busy, its merchants essential, its land prized. Yet this wealth made Cyprus a target. Whoever controlled the island could influence the balance of power. Archaeology shows palatial centres on Cyprus, influenced by Mycenaean and Levantine styles. The island absorbed many cultures. Frescoes, pottery, and architecture reveal a blend of influences, proof of Cyprus's role as crossroads rather than isolated land. But when the late Bronze Age weakened, Cyprus's advantage became vulnerability. Raids struck its shores. Ships once welcomed as traders could arrive as enemies, demanding or taking what they wished. Inland, copper production slowed. Mines once bustling with workers grew quieter as trade routes broke down. Palatial centres showed destruction layers. Some were rebuilt, others abandoned, echoing the wider pattern of the collapse. Cyprus's reliance on trade meant disruption hit hard. Without secure routes, copper lost much of its value. Letters found in archives mention Cyprus directly, sometimes with desperation. Kings asked for its copper even as conflict spread. The island's rulers were caught in a dilemma, unable to supply as before, yet unable to escape demand. Some scholars suggest Cyprus became staging ground for sea peoples, its harbours serving as bases for migration and raids. Pottery linked to the newcomers appears in Cypriot sites, blending with local traditions. Whether by choice or necessity, Cyprus absorbed these groups, reshaping its population and culture. Over time, the island adjusted. Local communities survived, but the palatial order never returned in the same form. The wealth once measured in shipments of copper turned inward, focused on sustaining life rather than feeding empires. Yet Cyprus's centrality never vanished. Even in collapse, it remained a bridge between East and West. Its mixed material culture became a quiet archive of survival. Evidence of trade, invasion, and adaptation blended together. Later, Cyprus would again rise as a significant player in the Mediterranean, but during the collapse, it stood as symbol of fragility. The island's fate shows how strength and weakness can be one and the same, depending on the tides of history. To walk its ancient ruins today is to sense layers of voices: miners, sailors, raiders, settlers, all part of a crossroads world. Cyprus at the collapse was not only a victim, but a mirror, reflecting how interconnection made the Bronze Age strong, and how it made it fragile. The collapse of empires may fill records, but behind it were countless ordinary lives. Farmers, herders, and artisans also faced the slow unravelling of their world. In villages, families woke to tend fields. They sowed barley and wheat, hoping rains would be kind, knowing drought could undo months of labour. Oxen pulled wooden ploughs through soil. Where water failed, harvests thinned, forcing families to stretch what little they had. Fishermen cast nets along the coasts. The sea, sometimes generous, sometimes empty, offered food when fields could not. Women spun wool and flax into thread, weaving textiles for households and sometimes for trade. Potters shaped clay on wheels, making jars for storage, cups for drinking, and lamps to light homes through long nights. Children played in courtyards, their games echoing traditions passed down for generations, even as the world outside grew less stable. Meals were simple: bread, olives, lentils, and fish. Luxury foods that once came from abroad grew scarce. In times of shortage, families learned to live with less. Meals shrank, celebrations quieted, and survival became the measure of success. Villagers built ovens of clay, baking bread for neighbours, sharing in hardship and comfort alike. Tools were repaired again and again. Metal was precious, often reforged rather than newly made. Local shrines offered a sense of continuity. People prayed for rain, for safety, for their children to grow strong. Festivals carried on, though smaller than before. Songs were sung, dances performed, giving rhythm to life even in hard times. Oral stories passed from elders to children carried fragments of the past, myths of gods, heroes, and distant kings. For many, the fall of palaces mattered little compared to the harvest or the catch of the day. Yet they felt the echoes when caravans stopped coming, when markets grew quiet, when soldiers arrived to take what they needed. Trade once brought foreign goods, but also foreign ideas. With its decline, horizons narrowed and lives grew more local. Still, resilience defined the people. Families adapted, planted hardier crops, and sought food in new ways. In coastal towns, fishing took on greater weight. Inland, herding sheep and goats became more essential. These shifts show survival was not passive. It was an active, creative process, reshaping traditions to fit new realities. Archaeology uncovers this resilience: repaired tools, reused jars, homes built from ruins of earlier structures. Even amid upheaval, people marked life's passages, birth, marriage, death, with rituals that gave meaning. Communities endured not because they were untouched by collapse, but because they found ways through it. These everyday lives remind us collapse was never only about kings. It was about ordinary people finding quiet strength. And it was their resilience that carried memory forward, preserving fragments of an age into the centuries that followed. In the late Bronze Age, the sea was both highway and horizon. Upon its waters moved ships that carried goods, people, and dreams. Egyptian galleys cut through the Nile Delta, long and narrow, propelled by oars and sails. They carried soldiers to defend borders and merchants to distant ports. The Hittites built sturdy ships for transport, though less famous than their chariots. Their harbours held vessels bound for Cyprus and beyond. The Mycenaeans, skilled sailors, launched sleek ships with high prows, suited for both trade and raids. Their pottery appears across distant shores. Each vessel carried not only cargo, but culture. Amphorae of oil, jars of wine, and crafted goods filled their holds. These ships connected kingdoms, turning sea into lifeblood. Without them, trade networks could not endure. Yet the same ships also carried warriors. Armies embarked across waves, turning highways of trade into routes of war. Egyptian reliefs show naval battles, ships colliding, archers firing arrows from decks, chaos rendered in carved lines. The Sea People's ships were distinctive, broad, with high curving sterns and prows. They could carry entire families across long distances. Frescoes suggest these ships were not just for raiding, but for migration, built to endure journeys of hope as much as conflict. Wagons sometimes followed ships, landing with people who carried their lives inland, seeking new beginnings. To those defending their coasts, such ships brought fear. To those on board, they were vessels of survival. The sea thus mirrored human choices: trade or war, cooperation or conquest, survival or loss. Even in destruction, ships were symbols of resilience. They carried communities away from famine, drought or defeat. In Egypt, ships patrolled the delta, holding back waves of migrants. On Cyprus, they delivered both copper and invaders. In the Levant, harbours once busy with merchants now faced fleets of strangers arriving without invitation. Ships were as much symbols as tools. Their prows carved with animal heads, their sails painted, they carried identities across the sea. For the sea peoples, ships were homes. Families slept under sails, cooked on deck, and lived between waves and wind. To archaeologists, ship depictions are vital clues, etched on reliefs, painted on pottery, preserved in memory. They remind us how central the sea was to this age, not as boundary, but as bridge. When kingdoms fell, ships carried away survivors, ensuring that even in collapse, people endured. They also carried seeds of new societies, spreading tools, styles and customs to distant coasts. A single ship could bring both ruin and renewal, its sails filled with fate unseen by those on shore. In this way, ships of war were also ships of hope, carrying stories from one age into the next. And across the quiet waters of the Mediterranean, their echoes still linger, painted in ruins and remembered in stone. The late Bronze Age did not end in a single night. Its collapse unfolded slowly, like a fading light at the close of day. Decades passed as palaces weakened, trade routes narrowed, and records grew fewer. At first, the signs were subtle: letters asking for grain, small rebellions, temples neglected. Then came fires. Palaces burned one after another, not always rebuilt, leaving blackened stones in their place. In Greece, Linear B tablets were preserved by flames, their baked clay the last trace of palatial scribes. In Anatolia, Hattusa's archives went silent. No more treaties, no more royal decrees, only ruins. The change was gradual, but relentless. Year after year, networks that had bound kingdoms unraveled. Merchants once busy with foreign wares found markets shrinking, their ships fewer, their journeys shorter. Artifacts show continuity alongside decline. Simple pottery styles replacing ornate designs. Luxury goods grew rare. Where gold and ivory once adorned rooms, clay and wood became common. Literacy faltered. In Greece, writing disappeared entirely for centuries, leaving only oral tradition. In smaller towns, life continued. Farmers still harvested, families still gathered, but horizons narrowed. The grand web of international exchange had been replaced by local economies, modest and practical. The collapse was not sudden chaos, but slow transformation, as people adapted to what remained. Temples stayed active, though rituals grew simpler. Faith endured even as palaces crumbled. Oral memory replaced written records. Stories of heroes and wars preserved fragments of the past. These tales, reshaped over generations, became the myths we still know today. To those living then, change may not have felt like collapse. It was a steady narrowing, a world growing smaller. A child born during decline may have never known the wealth of earlier days, only the simplicity of survival. The rhythm of life continued, but in quieter, humbler ways. Archaeology shows this layering: ruins of palaces reused as homes, old walls sheltering new generations. Slowly, the Bronze Age gave way to what would become the Iron Age, though its people could not name the shift. For them, it was simply life, one harvest after another, one generation after the next. From our distance, we call it collapse. To them, it may have felt like change, steady and inevitable. And so the late Bronze Age ended, not in a single moment of destruction, but in slow motion, its silence stretching across centuries. Long after the Bronze Age palaces fell, memories lingered, not in archives or letters, but in myths, stories and songs told by firelight. Oral tradition carried fragments of truth across generations. What was once history became legend, shaped by imagination and memory. In Greece, echoes of Mycenaean kings may live in Homer's epics. Heroes of the Iliad and Odyssey resemble rulers of palaces now in ruins. The story of the Trojan War may reflect real conflicts, a siege remembered not for politics, but retold as myth of honour and wrath. These stories grew with retelling. Each generation added details, polishing heroes, enlarging battles, turning fact into timeless tale. Collapse itself entered memory. Wandering peoples, lost kingdoms, and shifted lands became themes woven into legend. For Egyptians, the sea peoples became part of sacred narrative. Chaos defeated by Pharaoh, order restored. This mirrored their worldview. Every threat became symbol of disorder, and every victory affirmed divine balance. Myths also preserved migrations. Groups who settled in new lands remembered journeys across sea, though details blurred. In the Levant, traditions later recorded in biblical texts recall Philistines, often cast as outsiders who once arrived from afar. Memory painted them as enemies, yet archaeology shows they also brought crafts, foods, and tools that endured. Collapse was thus remembered both as loss and as transformation. What vanished in stone lived on in story. Oral tales gave meaning to suffering. They explained why cities fell, why strangers came, why old gods seemed distant. In such stories, gods often acted directly, punishing or saving, embodying natural forces people could not control. A drought became anger of a storm god. An invasion became punishment for broken oaths. These myths were not falsehoods, but interpretations, ways to frame chaos within human understanding. Over centuries, the lines between memory and myth blurred completely. Heroes became larger than life. Palaces forgotten by name were remembered only as homes of giants or demigods. Ruins became sacred. People visiting fallen citadels told tales of mighty ancestors whose strength could not be matched. Songs carried fragments of real events, voyages across seas, battles fought in distant lands, alliances broken. Archaeology often confirms traces beneath the myth: burned walls at Troy, abandoned palaces in Greece, destroyed cities in Anatolia. Yet myth and story gave these ruins a second life. They kept memory alive when writing had fallen silent. In this way, myths are archives, not of precise detail, but of emotional truth. They tell us how collapse felt. They also remind us that people long for continuity. Stories provided what ruins could not, a thread of connection. And so, even as the late Bronze Age passed into shadow, its memory endured in myth, whispering to the future through story. From the ruins of the Bronze Age, new societies slowly emerged. They were smaller, simpler, but carried seeds of renewal. Villages became the centres of life. Without palaces to direct them, communities turned inward, guided by local leaders. Farming remained the foundation. Barley, wheat, olives, and grapes sustained households, while herding sheep and goats added resilience. Metalworking continued, but now with iron. Unlike bronze, iron was harder to produce, yet more widely available. This shift marked the dawn of the Iron Age. Simple iron tools spread slowly, reshaping daily work. Pottery styles evolved, blending old traditions with new influences from migrating peoples. Homes were humbler, built from stone and mud brick, but designed to last through hard years. Trade shrank in scale, but did not vanish. Local exchange of grain, cloth and tools kept life moving. Harbours once filled with foreign ships now serve smaller vessels, carrying goods along nearby coasts. Religion endured. Shrines and temples continued, though rituals grew simpler, grounded in community life. New gods joined old pantheons. Migrants brought their deities, weaving them into local traditions. Oral tradition flourished. Without widespread writing, memory passed through songs, myths, and stories told at gatherings. These tales preserved fragments of the past while planting seeds of future culture. New political forms arose. Instead of vast empires, smaller kingdoms and city-states began to shape identity. In Greece, this shift laid the foundation for the polis, the city-state, that would dominate centuries later. In the Levant, new peoples like the Philistines and Phoenicians began to shape distinct identities. The Phoenicians in particular would later rise as masters of trade and navigation, carrying memory of the sea into a new age. Cyprus too adapted, blending traditions of migrants with its own, continuing as a crossroads of cultures. Egypt survived, though narrower in reach. Its strength rested on endurance, not expansion. Across Anatolia, small Neo-Hittite states carried fragments of Hittite culture forward in new forms. These new societies did not simply replace what was lost. They grew from it, like shoots sprouting from fallen trees. Collapse created hardship, but also cleared ground for new beginnings. The simplicity of smaller communities allowed flexibility, resilience, and survival. Over generations, these seeds matured into new powers, new cultures, and new voices that reshaped the Mediterranean. From silence, a new chorus slowly rose, carrying forward the lessons of fragility and the promise of renewal. The Late Bronze Age collapse is more than a distant event. It is also a quiet reminder of how fragile even the strongest systems can be. Great kingdoms relied on complex trade networks, believing them unshakable. Yet those same ties became weaknesses when disrupted. Egypt needed grain from its neighbours. The Hittites depended on copper and food imports. Mycenaean palaces thrived on trade. When one link broke, the rest felt the strain. Famine in Anatolia could ripple as far as Greece. Fragility lay not in strength itself, but in dependence on balance, an invisible balance few noticed until it faltered. Natural disasters tested that balance. Drought and earthquake strained supply and trust. Social unrest widened cracks. Farmers withheld loyalty, soldiers grew restless, and officials faltered in their duties. External pressure from migrations only added weight to a system already trembling. The collapse shows us that power built on complexity must also guard against vulnerability. Centralized palaces stored wealth and knowledge, but when one fell, whole regions lost stability. The reliance on writing was another fragility. When scripts disappeared, so did memory of treaties, trade, and laws. Silence replaced records, and myths filled the void. Fragility of knowledge proved as dangerous as fragility of walls. Archaeology reveals not sudden destruction, but patterns of strain woven over decades. In this, the collapse resembles a slow unravelling rather than a single catastrophe. Fragility was hidden within abundance. Prosperity made kingdoms dependent on delicate systems. When those systems faltered, wealth could not shield them. Gold could not summon rain. Bronze could not feed the hungry. The lesson is timeless. Complexity requires resilience, not only strength. Villages endured because they relied on simpler systems. Their resilience outlasted the grandeur of empires. Farmers who planted hardy crops survived where palaces failed. Communities with flexibility adapted, while rigid systems broke under pressure. The Late Bronze Age collapse reminds us that survival lies not in size, but in adaptability. Its fragility shows the limits of power, but also the quiet endurance of ordinary lives. The ruins teach humility. Greatness does not guarantee permanence. Yet fragility is not only weakness, it also clears space for renewal, for new societies to grow. From fragility came transformation, a quiet truth whispered through the ruins of an age once thought eternal. To understand the Bronze Age collapse, we rely not on living witnesses, but on fragments uncovered by archaeologists. Each ruin, shard, and inscription forms a piece of a puzzle scattered across centuries. Excavations at Hattusa reveal burned walls and broken archives, silent testimony to a vanished empire. In Greece, Linear B tablets preserved by fire offer the last words of palatial scribes before silence fell. At Ugarit, letters were left unfinished, clay tablets frozen mid-message, as if interrupted by disaster. Archaeologists carefully pieced together these fragments, reading absence as much as presence. A layer of ash speaks of fire. Collapsed walls suggest earthquake. Scarcity of imports points to broken trade. Pottery style reveal cultural shifts as newcomers introduce new forms while old ones faded. Radiocarbon dating provides timelines, but often with wide margins, leaving much uncertain. Inscriptions offer names of enemies, but not always clarity. Sea Peoples remains a vague label. The puzzle is complicated by gaps. Entire regions leave little trace, their stories lost in silence. Yet every fragment matters. A single seal, a broken jar, or a scratched inscription can shift understanding. Archaeology is detective work with missing pages, requiring patience and imagination. Scholars debate causes and connections, weaving theories from partial evidence. Some argue climate was decisive, others stress invasions or internal collapse. The puzzle remains open. What unites them is recognition that no single cause explains everything. Instead, collapse was layered, like the stratigraphy archaeologists dig through, one level upon another. The work continues in labs and sites across the Mediterranean, where dust brushes reveal secrets of forgotten lives. New technologies like DNA and residue analysis add pieces once invisible, showing diets, diseases, and migrations. Yet interpretation is always cautious. Archaeologists walk a line between evidence and silence. They reconstruct not certainty, but possibility, grounded in what fragments allow. The puzzle is never finished. Each discovery raises new questions even as it answers old ones. What remains clear is the human story behind the fragments, people who lived, worked, feared, and hoped. The archaeologist's puzzle is less about solving collapse than about listening to echoes within ruins. And in those echoes, we glimpse not only the past, but the timeless fragility and resilience of human life. Even in collapse, not everything was lost. Beneath the silence of ruined palaces, continuities quietly endured. Farmers still planted fields, trusting soil and rain to provide, even when kingdoms failed. Families gathered around hearths, preparing simple meals, sharing stories, and shaping resilience. Tools were repaired, reused, and reshaped. Continuity lay in daily effort, humble and steady. Pottery styles changed, yet clay vessels remained central, linking generations through familiar forms. Songs continued. Myths and stories replaced writing, carrying memory when scribes were gone. Shrines stayed active. Offerings of grain, oil, or incense kept faith alive, even as temples fell silent. Local gods endured, their names whispered by villagers long after empires crumbled. The cycle of seasons provided structure. Planting, harvest, and festivals still gave rhythm to life. Births, marriages, and burials marked time, preserving the flow of human experience. Coastal fishing villages survived storms of history, their nets cast as they had been for centuries. In highlands and valleys, herders guided flocks, living patterns little touched by imperial fall. These continuities remind us that collapse was never total. Life adapted, narrowed, but persisted. Memory of grandeur lingered in ruins, yet resilience thrived in quiet routines. Children learned from elders, inheriting skills, values, and fragments of history. Oral traditions acted as bridges, carrying echoes of lost kingdoms into future generations. Over centuries, these continuities seeded renewal. From villages rose new cultures, steady and enduring. The Phoenicians grew from Levantine survivors, carrying seafaring memory into an age of trade. In Greece, myths preserved Mycenaean echoes, preparing ground for later city-states. In Anatolia, small Neo-Hittite states carried traditions forward in adapted forms. These continuities were not loud, but steady, like the heartbeat beneath silence. They show collapse was not only an ending, but also a transformation. Grand networks fell, yet human life found balance again in smaller scales. Quiet continuity shaped the world that followed, stitching fragments of Bronze Age into fabric of the Iron Age. And in their quiet endurance, we hear history's softest truth, that even in loss, life continues.